All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Alyssa Minio. I am in Dr. Speicher's capstone for this semester and last semester. And my capstone project is titled Creating the 19th Century in the Modern World, The Stories of Benjamin and Loretta. I've written a series of interconnected short stories that will mimic the way that past texts were written through modern adaptations. These adaptations are inspired by popular texts from the 19th century, such as Rollo at School, The Coral Island, and Little Women, as well as moments from my own childhood. Readers follow the lives of Benjamin, a young boy living happily with his single mother, as he tackles what it means to be a man, and Loretta, the new girl in town, sure of herself and unafraid to show it. Although their experiences are different, the two connect quickly, bonding over individuality and laughs. Okay, so I have written 5 stories. The first story is titled Dancing Shadows and Storms, and this adaptation is based on literature from 1800 to 1820. And my second story is titled Benny's Garden, and this story is based on children's literature from 1820 to 1840. The third story is called Ben and the Boys and Loretta, and this one is based on stories from 1840 to 1860. The fourth story is The Story of a Good Girl, and this is based on literature from 1860 to 1880. And the last story is called Loretta Reaches for the Sky, and this story is based on literature from 1880 to the 1900s. So my first story, called Dancing Shadows and Storms, in this story, the reader is introduced to Benjamin and his mother. Late at night during a storm, Benjamin gets scared and he calls for his mother. She comes into his room and she sees that he's upset and asks him what's wrong. While he's comforted by her presence, he starts to feel a little bit childish for calling for her, and he's reluctant to respond. He's 12 years old and has been proclaimed man of the house, and it's here that Benjamin starts to question what it means to be a man. The story eventually ends with Benjamin's mother assuring him that emotions and vulnerability don't determine whether or not you are a man. And this story is specifically inspired by the text, The Swiss Family Robinson. And now I'm going to read a short excerpt from this story. So it starts off in the beginning. Fire-breathing dragons and sharp-toothed wolves of shadow danced across the blue walls of Benjamin's bedroom. The wolves howled as the wind rushed against his old windows, and the dragon's claws scratched against the glass. Benjamin lay in his bed with his soft blanket pulled up to his big brown eyes. Under the covers, he was safe from the dangers of the creatures, with nothing to fear but his growing imagination. Bright light flashed through his room, followed by a loud crack of thunder. And then from this point, this is where he calls for his mother, and she eventually comes in to try to comfort him. For this story, I thought that it was important to portray the ideal family, because this is a very prominent aspect of literature from this time. But in this portrayal, I chose to interpret the ideal family as a family that cares for each other and displays togetherness, even in hardship. While early 19th century children's literature shows an emphasis on the nuclear family, which is 2 parents living together with their children, I felt that it's not representative of modern times. We see a lot of blended families, single-parent families, so I wanted to be representative of that. The idea is that families can come in many different shapes and sizes. With this said, I thought that portraying Benjamin's mother as a successful single mother was a good idea for this story. In the story, a mother's success is not measured by the material things that the family owns or the financial status, but instead is measured in the relationship that she has with Benjamin. And the second story in my adaptations is Benny's Garden. I have to say this is probably one of my favorite stories out of the 5. I feel like it's one of Dr. Speicher's too. We definitely spent a lot of time discussing this one. And this story starts with Benny's morning routine. He gets dressed, he brushes his teeth like a good boy, and he has breakfast with his mother, and then he goes out to work in the garden. He has trouble filling his watering can, and so he ends up soaked, and this is where he meets Loretta, a confident young girl. Benjamin ends up showing Loretta his garden and his prized sunflowers. The two of them bond over their differences and become fast friends. And this story is inspired by the text Rollo at School, which was very popular during this time period. There's a bunch of stories that ended up coming after this that were inspired by Rollo. And the excerpt from this story that I'll be reading starts with, Benny stands at the side of the garden quietly, tin can in hand, and he lets her, Loretta, walk around. He smiles at her exclamations and giggles at her growing excitement. He only inches closer to her when she starts to make her way towards his section of the garden. Wow, look at these sunflowers. They're beautiful, Loretta says, reaching up to graze her fingers along the silky yellow petals. I grew those ones, all by myself. Loretta turns back to him, eyebrows drawn together. Aren't sunflowers a girl's thing? Benny shrugs off the comment. I guess they could be, but my mama says that girls and boys can like the same things. It doesn't matter whose things they're supposed to be. Loretta stays silent and nods. Yeah, sometimes the girls at my old school would make fun of me, because I like cars like my daddy. Nothing wrong with it. I like what I like. She goes back to her examination of the sunflowers, marveling at how big they've grown. She drifts from one flower to the next, weaving her way through the garden. And so this here is how the friendship between Benjamin and Loretta first start. And then from there, they grow their flowers together, and they definitely become friends very quickly. And for this text, my focus on, I guess, what inspired me from the 19th century literature is that gender norms are apparent in the 19th century literature. However, instead of instilling them throughout my story, I chose to challenge them. Supporting gender norms in such an obvious way seems outdated, and I felt that the more modern approach would be to counter this. My hope in this edition is that kids can be who they want to be without fear of backlash from others. It's okay to not fit the cookie-cutter mold that comes with gender norms. In addition, I didn't want this underlying lesson to be too obvious. Therefore, I don't introduce criticism to Benny Sunflowers until later in the text. So even before the excerpt that I read, Benny shows a lot of pride for his sunflowers. He never once questions them, and he has a lot of joy from planting them. And the next story is called Ben and the Boys and Loretta. In this story, Ben starts his day with his mother, eating breakfast and helping clean up. Then he goes out into his backyard to read his book. Loretta pops by, and the pair read together until Ben's other friends show up. The boys end up being rude to Loretta, and Ben falls prey to social pressures. Loretta leaves upset, and Ben knows that he acted rudely towards her. Later on in the story, Ben apologizes, and Loretta forgives him by returning the book that he had accidentally abandoned outside. And this story is inspired by the text The Coral Island and William Saunders, or Blessing in Disguise. And I'm going to start this excerpt when Ben's other friends, which are a group of 3 boys, come to hang out with him at his house and kind of interrupt his time with Loretta. Hi, Ben, Jimmy says, ignoring Lori by his side. Quite the garden you got going on over there. Thanks, Ben smiles. My mom, Lori, and I planted it this year. Want me to show you guys? He asks. Sure, the trio says, nodding along. Ben walks them over to the garden, showing off the vegetables that they've planted this summer. Weaving around the plants, he heads to the back part of the garden to show the prized area. These are the sunflowers and mixed pinks that we planted, he says proudly, lifting his head high. Jimmy looks at the flowers, taking a yellow petal between his fingers. You planted these? He says, scrunching up his nose and ripping the petal off. Inspecting the petal, Jimmy doesn't see Ben's face fall. His shoulders close in, and he puts his hands in his pockets. He starts, but Lori cuts him off. So what if he did? The boys look at each other and laugh. Ben assesses the situation and starts to join in on the laughter. Of course I didn't plant those. Taking a hand from his pocket, Ben reaches and rips off a pink petal. These were all Lori. I only help in the garden because I have to. Lori watches from the sidelines as the pink petal is crumpled and dropped to the dirt. tears well in her eyes at her friend's odd behavior around the boys. She had worked really hard growing those flowers all summer and keeping them alive, all for Ben to rip off a petal and toss it to the ground. "Aw, are you gonna cry, little girl?" Danny taunts. Lori relaxes her face and wills her unshed tears back into her eyes. Straightening her posture, she surveys the boys. "I'm not going to cry. I was just leaving," she responds with a turn. Ben reaches out to grab Lori, but his stubby fingers fall short, instead wisping through her hair as it swings behind her. And my inspiration for this text is shown through my analysis. Since a large part of the Coral Island was brotherhood and camaraderie, I decided to show this relationship not necessarily in the relationship between the boys in the story, but between Benjamin and Loretta, which is why they end up making up in the end. Even though Ben originally acted this way, this is kind of the start of, I guess, him falling into the whole boys will be boys mischief part of his life and growing up that was very much accepted and kind of urged during the 19th century. But at the end of the day, him and Loretta end up staying friends. He apologizes for what he did, and that's how I kind of show that friendship there. And then another way I chose to create this story is to kind of model that social pressure that boys face when it comes to how they act and how they behave around other people. And again, demonstrating that start of the whole boys will be boys ideology that, like I said, was very popular and is still very popular today. And then my next story is The Story of a Good Girl. So this title is kind of a play on one of my inspiration texts, which is called The Story of a Bad Boy. But in this story, Lori goes to school where she sees Benji, also Benjamin, and his friends that are about to skip class. She's disappointed in his behavior, but she doesn't say anything because there's already been a restraint on their relationship. After Loretta ends up going to class, Benji ends up coming in and he lies to Lori's teacher and he pulls her from class. He says that the office needs her, but really they don't. And he wants her to hang out with him. So while they're in the school garden, they both get caught, but only Lori gets in trouble. And then, again, this story is inspired by the Peterkin paper, The Mysteries Island, Ragged Dick, Little Women, and The Story of a Bad Boy. So I start this excerpt a little bit before Benjamin and Loretta get caught. This is after he ends up saying something rude to her that she doesn't take kindly to. So he turns to her confused and went to reach for her hand again. "What do you mean stuff like that?" "Like I'm a goody-goody. Like I don't know how to have fun." She pushed past him and sat on the old bench along the edge of the garden. He followed her and sat her opposite. "I never said that, Letty." "You basically did. I'm a nerd, remember?" Benji blows out a breath and shakes his hair out of his eyes. "I only said that to get the guys off your back. You know that. Besides, it was a joke." "It was a joke at my expense, and not a very good one at that." "Letty, No, it's okay," Letty interrupts. "I get it. Those are your friends, and I'm sure you want to get back to skipping class with them." Letty goes to stand at the glass as the glass door opens beside them, and a booming voice says, "What are you both doing out here?" Turning, they see Mr. Conway, the school PE teacher, standing in the doorway. Letty sits up straight, eyes widening, but Ben stays seated, posture relaxed. "Oh, hi, Mr. Conway. We were just getting some fresh air. That building is awfully stuffy, and it's such a nice day out for October." He ignores Benji. "Loretta, aren't you supposed to be in Mr. Moore's geometry class right now? I'd really expect more from you than skipping your first period class." "I wasn't skipping. You see, I was told to go to the office," and then she trails off and glances around. "Well, this surely doesn't look like the office, now does it?" he says. "Come on, I'll walk you back to class. Wouldn't want you losing your way again." Head bowed, Letty walks towards Mr. Conway, her argument with Benji forgotten. At the door, Mr. Conway turns back around, seeming to remember that Benji is still sitting on the bench outside. "Good luck at the basketball game on Friday. Hopefully you'll make some buckets." "Will do, Mr. Conway," Benji says, grinning. while Loretta stands there dumbfounded. "Well, Loretta, are you coming, or do I need to write you a detention slip?" "I'm coming, sir," she grumbles. And it's Letty, by the way. So in this part of the story, we see that Benji, also Benjamin, starts to take on, that role as the bad boy. Also, boys will be boys, while Loretta's in her, I guess, like, good girl era, where she's focused on school and getting good grades and, just behaving the way that she thinks she should in society. And then this also ties into the story that a bad boy doesn't remain a bad boy. He eventually will grow up. But there are those, I'm sure some of us know some, that don't really get out of that mindset. And Mr. Conway is an example of that in the story, where he still is kind of, I guess, trying to pretend he's in high school, and trying to bond with a student who clearly isn't doing what he's supposed to be doing. And he kind of takes it out on Loretta because, in this time, or in the 19th century, expectations for girls were much higher, as they still are today. So I didn't want to change that too much in my adaptation. And then my last story is Loretta Reaches for the Sky. So this is story number 5 in the adaptations. In this story, Loretta is very stressed out about school and keeping up with her many responsibilities. On this particular day, nothing seems to be going right for her. She had fallen asleep while reading to her little sister, and she forgot to do her homework. And then she forgets to pack her things for soccer, so she's not able to participate in her practice. So she has to take the bus home. So on her walk home from the bus, Benjamin's mom sees her crying. She then invites her in to eat some cookies and talk. And it's here that Loretta reveals how much she's been struggling. And Benjamin's mom eventually says to her, "The sky's the limit, but you don't need to hurt yourself reaching for it." And my inspiration text for this one was Five Little Peppers and How They Grew. So in this part of the story, I don't mention it in the summary, but this is also where the reader finds out that Benjamin is kind of starting to shift away from that bad boy role. He's now at a different school for, I guess, like gifted youth. So he's doing that, and he's kind of like starting a new pathway, getting away from the people that were kind of bringing him down and trying to steer him the wrong way. And then we also see Loretta struggle with something that isn't dependent on her being a woman. It's just dependent on her own life. School is a priority for her, so is her family, and the other responsibilities that she gives herself, compared to other media that we see today and other literature, where the main focus of a woman's problems is her being a woman, whether that's relationship problems or social problems with other students that are in her life. So I wanted to make sure that I kind of didn't go down that route when I gave her, her personality and everything. But yeah, so that is my last story. I want to thank you all for listening to me. Had a good time sharing, and I had a great time creating the stories. So thank you.